Hello, Jessica frost-ballas here with a video for Ellen Hutson. Today I've created a Friendship or Valentine's Day card for that magical friend in your life featuring some extra sparkly mermaids. So let's get started. First, I blended my background with Distress Oxide inks. I placed a round mask on a piece of Strathmore Bristol smooth cardstock to mask off my sun, and then blended Spun Sugar, Worn Lipstick, Abandoned Coral, and Festive Berries Distress Oxide inks to create a vibrant sunset. I blended on each color and then went back and forth between the colors until my blending was smooth. Then I removed the mask and set it aside to dry. Next, I stamped the mermaid tails from Inner Mermaid onto a panel of Neenah Solar White cardstock with Copic-friendly, intensified black ink from Hero Arts. I used my Misty to stamp the tail on one side of the A2 panel, and then rotated the panel and stamped again. I left the stamp on the lid of my Misty and then dried the ink thoroughly. Then I colored the tails with blue-green Copic markers. I started with my lightest marker and then added my darkest shade around the edges of the tail. I blended back down to my lightest shade and added a little more of the darker for contrast. Just make sure your ink is really dry or it will smudge with the lighter colors. Then I placed my panel back inside my Misty and inked the stamp again, this time with clear sticky embossing ink. I stamped the first tail, rotated the panel, and then stamped the second tail. Then I sprinkled the panel with gold glitter embossing powder and heat embossed it with my heat gun. Next, I die cut the same size circle from a post-it note and placed it over the blended panel. Then I blended Squeezed Lemonade and Abandoned Coral Distress Oxide ink over the circle to create my sun. Once I had my first layer of color down, I removed the mask and blended the same colors into the background for a smoother finish. Off camera, I stamped the sentiment from Pure Magic onto black cardstock with embossing ink and heat embossed it with gold embossing powder. I wanted to trim it down to a thin label and realized that I could use my dies from the Nice of You set. I just found a die that was the appropriate size, taped it in place, and had a perfect label sentiment. I also die cut the word friend from the block word set twice from white cardstock and once from gold glitter cardstock. I used liquid glue to adhere them together to create a thick chipboard-like sentiment. I let that dry while I worked on some additional blending. I realized I forgot waves, so I blended Blueprint Sketch and Chip Sapphire Distress Oxide ink onto a scrap of Strathmore Bristol smooth cardstock and die cut it with the Essentials by Ellen die. Then it was time to assemble my card. First, I planned out the layout and arranged all the pieces. To add my individual letters, I reserved the scrap of cardstock that I die cut the word from initially to use as a template. Then I placed a piece of low-tack tape over the front of the scrap and flipped it over. I puzzle pieced each letter into the scrap and then added liquid adhesive to the letters. Then I flipped it right side up again and pressed the scrap and letters to my blended panel. I removed the low-tack tape and carefully lifted the scrap template. I used to place the scrap on the panel first and then puzzle piece each letter in with liquid adhesive, but realized that I would often end up accidentally gluing the scrap in place and end up with a mess. This is much easier and less messy. You can trim the scrap down as much as needed to make sure you have a good idea of where you're placing the sentiment, or use a translucent washi for better placement. I adhered the rest of the pieces, and then disaster struck. I left my craft room for 2 minutes to go get a cup of coffee, and apparently the gold glittery embossing powder caught the eye of my kitten, who I thought was asleep, and he quickly ripped off parts of the tails. So if you look closely here, you'll see that the tails are slightly different than what you saw me color earlier. I used the same colors and techniques, but there's a little variation. I locked my cat out of my room and then added my glitter to finish the card. I spread a little Nuvo crystal glaze along the sides of the tails, and then used a cheap paintbrush to brush the glue towards the center of each tail. I sprinkled the tails with chunky glitter from Lawn Fawn and a teal glitter from Wow embossing powder. And that's it. You can find more information on all the products I used in the YouTube description below. I hoped you enjoyed today's card. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, have a fantastic day and happy crafting. Bye!